Hello, everyone. This is Dr. Alexander Rosenthal from the Petrarch Institute. Welcome to our introduction to our upcoming course on Plato's Republic. I'm here with my friend and co-founder, Dr. Miles Smith. You want to say hello, Miles?
Hello, everybody. Great to have you back again. A number of you are returning from our other courses, and we hope you enjoyed those. Alex, for this upcoming course, we're tackling probably one of the biggest fish in the ocean of philosophical swimmers, right? I mean, it's something that almost everyone has heard of, and I think you once said everyone agrees it's important, but a lot of people, including the very smartest people, scratch their heads about what exactly it means.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, we're going to run this course on Plato's Republic. We'll go slow. We'll do it book at a time. So in this first course, it'll be the first 5 books of Plato's Republic. And the first question to ask is, I guess what Miles was kind of alluding to is the question of, well, why study Plato, right? And as he remarked, Plato is a very well-known thinker. Just to give a few famous quotes. So St. Augustine, for example, referred to Plato, who is justly preferred to all the other philosophers of the Gentiles, right? And more recently in the 20th century, Alfred North Whitehead famously said, the safest generalization of the European philosophical tradition is that it consists of a series of footnotes to Plato. So across, 15, 16 centuries, there's a broad consensus about Plato's centrality in philosophy. But as Miles kind of alluded to, not everyone agrees on precisely what he was saying all the time. And that applies particularly to what many consider to be his magnum opus and perhaps the most widely read of his works, the Republic, translation of the Greek politeia, right, which we could translate perhaps as constitution or something like that. Sometimes regime is used as a translation, but since Roman times, it's been called the Republic. And so what we're going to look at today are different ways of reading the Republic, and hopefully we'll make a good case for why it's worth reading. So I don't know, Miles, was there anything you wanted to add before we get started?
Well, just in the just as a teaser, the 2 quotes you gave from Whitehead and Augustine, it shows the wide areas, not just of philosophy, but just human thought and endeavor that lean on Plato and specifically on this book, The Republic. And it goes to everything from knowledge and mathematics and sort of the world of forms, for example. You'd see that in someone like Whitehead, or theology, and even more especially political theology, a lot of which really gets its formal theoretical start with Plato and with the Republic. So that's a huge scope of things to use as lenses to glean a bit of what's going on in this, substantial and incredibly dense and very subtle work. And I guess, you would agree it's written as philosophy, but in another way, it's also written and read as literature because it takes the form of a dialogue with different characters whose trustworthiness, whose alignment with Plato or with Socrates can be open to endless discussion. But I think you wanted to help give people at least a starter by looking at some of the main schools or ways in recent times we've interpreted or tried to make sense of the Republic.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, as you can imagine, for a book which has been well known since the 4th century BC, there's a very long tradition of commentary, as you can imagine. So there's no possible way we can cover all of that. One can think of the classical commentators, Neoplatonists like Proclus, or the influence he had on so the Stoics wrote their own republics, like Zeno of Citium. Cicero wrote his Republic. There are Islamic and Byzantine commentary traditions. It was lost to the West for a long time, but has recovered with Marsilius Ficino during the Renaissance. So we could go on forever, and reading some of these commentaries is also brings home the point that you just made, Miles, about the literature aspect, because one sees the potential depths of symbolism and layers of meaning that are in this composition. I mean, it's composed in a very sophisticated way. But perhaps precisely because of that, there isn't really even consensus on precisely what the focus of the Republic is, precisely what are the themes. So today I was going to look at three rather contemporary approaches, or let's say at least that have emerged, let's say, since the 20th century. The first one is we could say the straightforwardly political reading of the Republic, right, which just basically reads it as what it appears to be from the beginning, which is a treatise on political philosophy, the question of justice and the just society, and a vision of what society should be like. The second is based off of something Plato says starting in the book 2, which is that we can look at the human soul, the inner cosmos, as it were, of the human soul better by looking at this example of the city. And in that sense, takes a more allegorical approach, we could say. And then a third school is Werner Jaeger, one of the most renowned classicists of the 20th century, who wants to accent this idea. What he's really doing is a dramatic or radical reform of Greek paideia, which is their system of education, reforming it so as to give a new concept he introduces, theology, a centrality. And so that the real theme of this work is, what is the aim of paideia? What should be its objectives? And how should paideia, or education, proceed in the formation of people? So those are the three broad approaches. So we maybe just jump in and look at the straightforwardly political reading, right? Looking at it simply as a treatise on political philosophy, or primarily as a treatise on political philosophy. And here I would want to look at two approaches, right? One is the reaction I think many people will have on their first reading, which is sort of the outraged liberal, right? I mean, in some sense, if you look at this as a text of political philosophy from the standpoint of the dominant Western theory of what values should be central to politics, it would be difficult to be more scandalous than the Republic, right? So Karl Popper writes this book, The Open Society and Its Enemies, and he singles out Plato as the root of all the problems, essentially, right? He's writing, let's say, during or after totalitarianism, right? And he wants to defend the liberal democratic vision. And he's asking the question, well, how could these things arise? And from his modern way of reading the Republic, well, what do you see in the Republic? We see, he says, first of all, collectivism over individualism, right? So he argues that the state or the polis is given an absolute primacy over the individual. There is censoriousness, right? So Plato goes after the poets and tells them what they can write and not write. And then the other, so if liberty is one of the central values of modern liberal democracy, another would be equality. Plato is anything but egalitarian in the Republic, right? So we have, it explicitly speaks of aristocracy as the best form of government. It explicitly takes aim at democracy as leading to licentiousness and the overturning of hierarchies, and the way Popper puts it, there must be censorship of all activities of the ruling classes, a strict division of the classes, right? And he says that Plato recognizes only one standard, the interest of the state. This is he goes on to say, this is the collectivist, the tribal, the totalitarian theory of morality. So yeah, and so you have this sort of backlash, we could say, right? This outrage, let's say, at the proposals that Plato makes as the ideal state, which so much jar, let's say, the values of let's say, liberal democratic modernity. Here, I don't mean liberal in the American, in the sense common in the U.S. to mean left of center. This means liberal in the sense of liberal democracy, right? Privileging the freedom and autonomy of the individual. The Republic seems to really rankle those sensitivities. And when Allan Bloom spoke about teaching Plato in the 1980s, he said he found similar things, right? Especially when you got to things like censorship of music and these sorts of things that one finds in the Republic. So this is, I think, going to be a very common contemporary or modern reading of the Republic, because we are reading it through the lenses of our own societies and the value systems which have been inculcated in our time. And I think a lot of people are going to be reacting in that way, scandalized, as it were. So the first thing to think about is trying to first understand the text within its own context, perhaps, in order to get an understanding of why Plato is saying the things that he is saying. Now, another approach, quite different, is the approach of the Straussian school, right? Who kind of privileged Plato and thought it was very important to go back to him. The reason for that is something Strauss says here in his essay, The Three Waves of Modernity. He says, the crisis of modernity reveals itself in the fact, or consists in the fact, that modern Western man no longer knows what he wants, that he no longer believes what he can know about what is good and bad, what is right and wrong. Until a few generations ago, it was taken for granted that man can know what is right and wrong, what is just or the good or the best order of society. In a word, that political philosophy is possible and necessary. In our time, this faith has lost its power, right? We won't get into Straussianism in any detail, but basically he argues that value-free science combined with historical relativism, the sense that all morality is conventional, right, have basically undermined the confidence in political philosophy. The modernity for Strauss has become relativistic. And so he argues, right, Plato is more immediately relevant for us than is Aristotle. And he says because Plato or Socrates, the two are indistinguishable for all practical purposes, laid the foundation for political philosophy. In other words, if you want to understand what the argument is that philosophical reason can lay hold of conceptions concerning the just and the unjust, we need to begin at the beginning, and that beginning is Plato. Plato is the first political philosopher in the Western tradition. Now, his disciple, Allan Bloom, who was also working from Strauss's ideas to a large degree, calls the Republic, he also did a translation of the Republic, which includes an interpretive essay. He says the Republic is the true apology of Socrates, right? Now, what is that? What does Bloom mean? Well, he means that what the theme of the Republic is the relationship between philosophy and politics, right? So, according to Bloom, Socrates was killed because he was seen as subverting the traditional piety and mores of Athenian society, right? Philosophy, which was something emerging, at least political and moral philosophy, was just emerging with Socrates. Socrates is really the first figure, was seen as a subverter, right? Someone who puts to question the traditional mores, and therefore is a destructive force. We see that very strongly, for example, in Aristophanes, right, and how Aristophanes views Socrates, right? And Bloom goes on to say, the city sees only the apparent atheism of the philosopher and his effect on the young. Remember, Socrates is tried for impiety, right, for not honoring the gods. And so Bloom sees this as a kind of imaginative essay, in some sense, on what would it be like for philosophy and politics to be reconciled, right? To have a society of philosopher kings, right? What would it mean for the highest wisdom to govern a society? And so that's another approach. So I think that those two extremes, in some sense, right? Because Strauss wanted to put modern ideas to the question using the ancients, whereas Popper is simply, in some sense, saying this is sort of blasphemy, right? Plato is sort of blasphemy in the sense that he attacks the highest values of the modern political project, and therefore is a malevolent force in some sense. Those are sort of the poles, I think, of the straightforwardly political interpretation of the Republic. I don't know, Miles, was there anything you wanted to bring in on that point?
No, I think that paves the way for the other considerations, because you've got a kind of funny position of a kind of quixotic figure in Socrates who is not, let's just say, the establishment, right? He's a fairly impoverished outsider who, to say the least, in danger of persecution at some point, and yet he's advocating for an absolute and truthful view of the world, which must be pursued through dialogue and through much uncertainty, and yet that will be branded, in hindsight, totalitarianism. So, the sort of enigmatic aspect of it is kind of underscored a bit there, but it also paves the way to the other perspectives that you were talking about summarizing.
Yeah. So I think the opposite viewpoint is kind of emphasizes the microcosm, macrocosm aspect, right? So why does Plato's Republic even begin to talk about the good society? It evolves from a discussion about justice, right? But then it soon moves to the question of the good society. And Socrates has this image of, it'll be easier to look at this question looking at a city, right? And we end up having these analogies between the parts of the city and the parts of the soul. So there's another reading which sees it as largely an allegory, right? Not really centrally about a concrete proposal for how government should be run, so much as an allegory for the rightly ordered soul. So, for example, Julia Annas, who's a well-known scholar, classic scholar, she writes in her book Politics in Plato's Republic, her article, our tradition of reading the work as primarily political arises from a very particular combination of circumstances in the 19th century, right? So her argument is this is not the traditional way of reading the Republic. And the fact that we read it in this way, reacting to it in this way, is a reflection more about our own time and our own the concerns of our own time that has shaped the way we come to this text. And he says, and she goes on to say, what is actually said is that the state is brought in to illuminate the soul, because justice in the state is supposedly easier to discern. Once we read the answer there, we can go on to apply it to the individual. And she goes on to say, Plato's indicating that for an individual to become moral, he must do more than tinker with his beliefs and attitudes. He must grasp the ideal of virtue, right? So that this is sort of taking Socrates' image in Book 2 at his word, that this is a kind of image play, right? We're going to look at the cosmos, the order in a city, and this is going to tell us what the rightly ordered soul would be like, and ultimately answer the question that's raised in Book 1, why is it better to be just than unjust, right? When we understand what it would mean to have the harmonious parts of the city in order, in right order, we'll understand also what it would mean to have the parts of the soul harmoniously ordered. She goes on to talk about he should internalize the ideal of virtue as a city of himself, right? Which I think is in the text itself. So that's another kind of approach. I don't know, Miles, if you wanted to say anything on that before we look at Werner Jaeger's approach.
Perhaps only that there's a bit of a bridge there, because I mean, for me, there is some compatible merit in these three approaches, and depending on your temperament, you might be open at least partially to all of them. But certainly in our day, one thing that's very interesting is I think we're becoming acquainted again of how the use of different faculties in and among people changes our social reality. So, for example, if it's driven by reason and discourse, that's one thing. If powerful images and emotions are unleashed, that's another. And if there's a kind of celebration of the will, that has individual consequences, but it also has social and ultimately political consequences. So I think in some ways, this pivot that you've just offered, that if we start from the microcosm and think about the projection of the individual outward for the result that often becomes palpably, historically visible in the city-state, you understand why education is one of the determinants par excellence. So Werner Jaeger, who's, we've mentioned Werner Jaeger in many of our courses. He's illustrious for many reasons, but he may possibly be onto something here.
Yeah, exactly. So I mean, I personally, I'm a little bit drawn. I think there's merit to all three of these. All three are kind of legitimate readings. You could read it as a text of political philosophy, read it as an allegory, or read it as paideia. But I'm a little bit drawn to Jaeger's reading, focusing on paideia, because to me it makes sense when you look at so much of the substance of the text, right? He kind of quipped that, in one of his books, that people say, well, it's an interesting book, but it says why does he go on and on about education? And he said that's a little bit like saying the Bible is an interesting book, but it keeps talking about God. So what's going on there? So thought it was kind of interesting. Maybe we should look a little bit because I think if we look at this very historical approach of Jaeger, it might help to look a little bit at the role of paideia in Greek culture and see what Jaeger thinks Plato is doing here, right? So the first thing to mention is there was a traditional form of paideia, and Plato in the Republic talks about Homer as ten helade pepaidokon, the educator of all Greece, right? So this traditional form of the archaia paideia, right, was based around poetry, right? Poetry and gymnastics to a degree, right? It was called musical education, but music would include poetry. And so this was really the basis of what we could call traditional Greek education. In his Phaedrus, Plato talks about the poets, and he says, a third kind of possession and madness comes from the muses. This takes hold upon a gentle and pure soul, arouses it, inspires it to songs and other poetry, and thus by adorning countless deeds of the ancients, educates later generations, right? Educate later generations. So what is he? I think we see two things there. One is the connection with religion, right? So the poets, why is Plato so concerned about the poets? Well, people forget that the poets are mediators between the divine and the human. These are not creative people like we might think of them, who are writing dissident ideas and he wants to get rid of it. The point is that these are even more exalted, right? These are the mediators. Homer would be considered the mediator in a sense between the divine and the human, right? And therefore people were copying and modeling their behavior after the paradigma, right? The models which they saw in Homer's poetry. So this connection between religion and education, let's say the old religion, the traditional religion, and education is very powerful. And I think you see in the characters of Cephalus and Polemarchus, they turn to the poets, right? It was a very common practice. So you get maxims of ethics from the poets. Now, what's tending to happen in as Jaeger sketches it, right, including in books like works like Humanism and Theology, and other works of his, is that this old form of paideia and the beliefs that go along with it are coming under increasing strain, right, for many reasons. One is the war, right? I mean, there's a tremendously destructive war, the Peloponnesian War, right, which is in many senses destroying the foundations of Greek society, or challenging them. But the crucial thing is this new form of paideia, which is the paideia of the sophists, right, the rhetorical form of paideia, right? And what this is doing is a number of things. One is questioning the traditional mythos, right? Secondly, it takes what I think Jaeger calls an anthropocentric perspective, right? This comes through very clearly with Protagoras. Protagoras says man is the measure of all things, of things which are that they are, and of things that are not that they are not, right? So what matters is the human realm, and paideia is about acquiring the arete, the excellence that makes for political success, right? It's a very human-centered vision. In fact, it leads directly into religious skepticism. So Protagoras says, as touching the gods, I do not know whether they exist or not, nor how they are featured, for there is much to prevent our knowing, the obscurity of the subject and the brevity of human life, right? So we have a situation of doubt and skepticism about the tradition, the traditional paideia and the traditional religion, we could say. And combined with this, right, religious skepticism is a rising cynicism, right? That morality is anything other than convention, right? We see this, for example, in Thucydides, right? The Melian dialogue, right? Where the Athenian diplomats say to the people of Melos, right as the world goes is only in question between equals in power, while the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must, right? So we have this idea that, well, there is no ethics from the gods, right? Limiting things. What matters is earthly success, right? And what we see on earth, and descriptively this seems to have a certain amount of validity, is that the stronger powers prevail and the weaker are sort of, eliminated from history in some sense. And so we have this idea, therefore, in some of the late sophists, for all their contributions, that paideia is about the acquisition of power. It's about success. It's about what do you need to say in a given context to win you prosperity and power and success, right? And so it's a very worldly kind of idea. Now, this figure is very clearly represented, I think, by Thrasymachus in Book 1, right? Who says that justice is naught but the will of the strong. So Plato is going to go up against the sophistic or rhetorical perspective, right? But he also believes that, let's say, the growing rational self-consciousness, together with some of the problems in the poetic tradition, let's say the comportment of some of the gods and heroes, right, make the old paideia both metaphysically and morally problematic in certain ways, right? And therefore there has to be a new center, as it were, right? The old center is not holding, right, in some sense, and we need a new center. And that new center, he speaks in Book 2 of tupoi pere theologias, right? So outlines concerning theology. He brings this new concept in of theology, the science of God, right? So he wants now to make to agathon, the good, the divine, the very center of paideia, right? So proper paideia for Plato is not going to be about acquiring riches and power in the city. A proper paideia ultimately leads to the divine, right? It's about the ascent of the soul from the world of the senses to the divine. So it's this very lofty, we could say, kind of concept that he brings in. And so if you look throughout much of the text, you see this idea of the paideia of the ruler as being the most important theme virtually in the whole text. So I think that's more or less an outline what Jaeger's perception is. So we see Plato, I think, battling the poets and battling the rhetor statesmen in some sense in many of his works, not only the Republic, but certainly in the Republic as well, right? In the Gorgias, which we covered at one point, is the idea of Socrates as the true statesman. So, yeah, so I think that's more or less Jaeger's perspective. Did you want to add anything, Miles?
Well, actually, I think that's a natural segue because from that, some of the drama of book one is prefigured nicely, including the form it takes and the characters and the themes that they start to grapple with. So it's to me, it's an interesting breakout of a little bit of who Plato is as an author, but also especially the Republic and why it's significant, and that tees us up to see people on the other side at lecture one for book one.
Absolutely, and I hope some of you join us. We're on Udemy. I'll put up the link, and once the course is out, and I'll look forward to seeing some of you in our course. Take care, everyone.